Hi, my name is Noah Check. I'm the Stormwater Compliance Coordinator for the City of St. Cloud. The City's Stormwater Division works to protect the city's water resources through effective stormwater management and public education. Today I'll be taking you on a tour of Lake George's water quality and stormwater management history to learn about what has changed over the years, what we as a city are doing now to protect it, and how we can work together as the public and the city to protect this great water resource of St. Cloud. Lake George was first surveyed by R.B. Blake in 1855. Back then, Lake George spanned 50 acres going all the way to the north, all the way to St. Mary's Cathedral. It was a real shallow lake, more like a big wetland at that time. In 1876, the lake was really starting to dry up just because of dry weather, and it was filling in with weeds and algae. And at that time, Lake George had a natural outlet kind of on the northeast side of the lake through a ravine to the Mississippi River. The lake shrunk down to about half of its original size. In 1921, Lake George's water levels became even lower with the development of the Pantown neighborhood. That development diverted stormwater runoff and groundwater to the Sauk River instead of the natural flow that brought that water into Lake George. In 1928, Lake George was dredged to be a deeper 8-acre lake like we know it today. The excess material that was dredged out of Lake George to make it deeper was used to fill the outer boundary so those areas could be developed. Lake George is now about an 8-acre, 30 feet deep lake, and it transformed Lake George from being kind of an, aesthetically not pleasing wetland at that time into a beautiful municipal park and an ice skating rink hotspot. Water quality has always been a big part of Lake George's history. Some of the highlights over the years were, in the 1900s, Lake George actually had 2-foot thick blocks of ice cut from the lake in the winter to use to keep people's food cold in St. Cloud during the year, as there weren't refrigerators back in those days. However, in 1911, the State Department of Health deemed the water quality of that ice to be unsafe for people to use next to their food. And that had mostly to do with the poor water quality in Lake George turning into that ice. So about 20 tons of ice had to be destroyed that year. However, in 1912, a copper sulfate treatment was used in the lake to purify and clear and clean that water in order for it to be used again for ice, which was successful. That is one of the first known and high profile, documented water quality improvement projects in the lake, and really highlighted how the water quality in Lake George was important even in those days. Kind of fast forward a little bit, in the mid-1970s, a fountain was installed in Lake George because people were concerned with the amount of water that was in the lake and a lot of algae. So that fountain was installed and designed to try and bring more water into the lake and reduce some of those nuisance green algae conditions that people were seeing in the lake. Fast forward to 1998, when the stormwater treatment pond, also known as Little George, was constructed south of Lake George. The goal of Little George was to capture stormwater pollutants such as sediment, phosphorus, and other chemicals that could wash into Lake George previously and divert them into the stormwater pond to provide treatment for the roughly 50 acres of stormwater runoff that drains into the pond. So the pond is acting as a kind of a buffer of pollutants before the lake. So in 1998, the city definitely recognized that stormwater treatment and management was a big part of trying to protect Lake George and keep the water quality aesthetically pleasing for the public. Continuing with its water quality treatment efforts, the City of St. Cloud installed a shoreline restoration project in 2002. Over 17,000 native plants were installed around the lake and over 100 trees to create a buffer zone between the lake and stormwater runoff. The shoreline restoration prevents erosion, filters stormwater runoff, and also provides habitat, in turn leading towards kind of filtered and better water quality in and around Lake George. As the city continued to focus on stormwater management and treatment to protect Lake George, 2 rain gardens were installed in the northeast parking lot of Lake George, with the idea that stormwater runoff coming across the parking lot would enter into the rain garden, where that runoff was allowed to filter and infiltrate into the ground. The soil and the plant roots kind of acted as the treatment, where any pollutants like sediment, phosphorus, chemicals, things like that would have a chance to get filtered out, and the soil could provide that treatment. instead of sending this runoff directly to Lake George, keeping those pollutants from affecting the water quality of the lake. From the 1911 copper sulfate treatment to the rain garden installed in 2010, the city made great progress in improving water quality and protecting Lake George. However, these projects were not enough because Lake George was put on the state impaired waters list in 2012. The reason for being put on the state's impaired waters list was because the lake was still experiencing high levels of phosphorus and low water clarity. In 2017, the city, led by the Stormwater Division, created a Lake George Stormwater Management and Improvement Plan. The goals of that plan were quite simple. What can be done to get Lake George removed from the state's impaired waters list? How can we improve the aesthetic conditions of Lake George, preventing some of those nuisance algae, those blue-green algae blooms on the lake? How can we maintain fisheries for public events where kids can come out and still catch those fish? So those main goals were set in place in 2017. What we learned from that plan, and through some additional sampling in the lake and of the sediment bottom of the lake, trying to learn what is causing the lake to have this high levels of phosphorus, the poor water clarity, how can we narrow it down to what do we need to do to continue with improvements to the water quality. We really started to understand that there were two things that we had to look at, and kind of two ways to look at the lake. There was the internal loading of nutrients or phosphorus, and there was the external sources coming into the lake. So first, on the internal side, phosphorus that would come into the lake would kind of provide that food to the algae. Algae would grow, reduce that water clarity, create some of those nuisance conditions on the lake. Now, that would happen maybe during lake turnover as changes happen in the lake. So internally we knew we had to address what was happening with the phosphorus and the nutrient levels from the lake bottoms. That's when in 2018, the city began implementing aluminum sulfate treatments in the lake, or alum treatments. So we completed about 6 alum treatments in the lake with the idea to address that internal loading issue of phosphorus that was causing some of those nuisance conditions to Lake George. Here is drone footage of the alum application process. The white flock seen is an aluminum hydroxide precipitate that forms when the liquid alum contacts the water. It binds with phosphorus, so it can no longer be used as food by algae. The alum strips phosphorus from the water column, and it also prevents phosphorus in the lake bottom sediments from releasing, or creating what we call that internal loading issue when the lake turns over or when there are changes in the lake. The alum used in Lake George is the same product used in drinking water treatment. As the alum treatments in the lake were doing a great job at addressing the internal loading issue of phosphorus in the lake, we knew it was time to start implementing the stormwater management, or addressing the external loading of pollutants to Lake George from our 2017 plan. In order for us to meet those goals of mitigating the nuisance algae conditions and improving the lake to a point to remove it from the state's impaired waters list, we knew we had to really lower that phosphorus level that would lead towards that clarity, and we had to manage the stormwater runoff differently and maintain the stormwater treatment practices that were previously installed. So back here at Little George, installed in 1998, in 2018 we dredged it for the first time. So that means we're performing just kind of that routine maintenance on it. Little George did its job over those 20 years, capturing sediment and other pollutants attached to that sediment, where it's time to be cleaned. It was over half full of sediment at that time. The pond is about 5 or 6 feet deep in the middle, and we removed in 2018 over 900 tons of sediment from Little George. And that's just washing in from the roughly 50-acre watershed into the pond, and the pond is preventing those pollutants from getting to the lake. So it was time to get those out of there to really keep protecting Lake George. The pond was dredged, and we knew we needed to probably do something more to the pond to kind of keep with its effectiveness, or get it to be and perform even more effective. So similar to the alum treatments in the lake, the city actually partnered with the University of Minnesota and installed iron filings right into the stormwater pond after it was dredged. Those iron filings, kind of like the alum treatment, are designed to prevent the internal loading of that phosphorus, really to kind of knock out some of what I call that dissolved phosphorus that we can't see, that's not attached to the sediment. So those iron filings would kind of break down and hold the phosphorus in the pond, which is where we want them to stay. So with that maintenance and kind of starting to address the external load of the stormwater management load, we knew we were on the right track to meeting those goals for Lake George in our plan. And we knew we had to kind of keep track of how effective are we being, so we really started it in 2018, continuous monitoring, grabbing samples in Little George and Lake George to make sure that the pond was doing what it intended to do after it was dredged and after we installed the iron filings. So there's about 120 total acres that drains into Lake George for stormwater runoff. So in 2020, the City of St. Cloud received about a $700,000 grant in partnership with Stearns Soil and Water Conservation District to install a stormwater treatment system for the 60 acres of runoff kind of coming into the lake from the west side. So we installed 2 treatment systems that work in sequence. Stormwater runoff is diverted into an underground concrete vault that acts as a stormwater pond underneath the northwest parking lot of Lake George by the Veterans Memorial. That concrete vault or underground pond is designed to kind of slow the water down and settle out some of those sediments and pollutants and capture some of the floatables and the garbage and trash with different baffles and weirs, similar to how Little George is on the surface. Underground then, what also is happening, as that water leaves that underground pond, it'll go into an underground filtration system vault that we have open here. So this concrete vault has 60 cartridges that have filter media installed designed to capture those finer sediments and those more dissolved pollutants that we can see. These cartridges also will need maintenance over time. So the cartridges are filled with a perlite-based material that is our filter media. So as this media is doing its job, you will be able to visually see it change from this white color to more of a dirtier kind of dark brown, black color. And then we're gonna have to replace that media. So this system was put in 2020. Actually in 2024, the media was spent. So all 60 cartridges had the filter media replaced. So as a routine maintenance for this stormwater system, similar to the pond, similar to eventually we're gonna have to take sediment out of the underground pond as well as part of what we're doing for stormwater management. So with that and those 2 watershed or external projects, the stormwater side of things going to Lake George, we have the treatment pretty well under control, where about 95% of stormwater runoff is running through some sort of treatment system, from previous projects like the rain gardens or the buffer to more today's projects, this underground system, to just maintaining what was installed in 1998 with the pond. Water quality monitoring and data collection has been completed regularly by city staff since 2017 to determine if the lake is continuing to meet state water quality standards, to understand changes in the lake, and to see how the projects have been improving water quality in Lake George and the stormwater pond. Some of the data that's collected is water clarity, dissolved oxygen and temperature, phosphorus, algae, nitrogen, and we also grab samples for chloride and a few other pollutants as indicators to changes in water quality. Samples are regularly collected depending on the time of year or what the results are, either every other week or at least once a month on both the pond and the lake.
Hi, I'm Olivia.
And I'm Hannah, and we're environmental compliance assistants for the City of St. Cloud.
We collect water samples from Lake George and Little George once or twice a month from spring until fall, and we're going to show you how we collect our data today.
This little disc is called a Secchi disc, and we use this device to measure water clarity. So we'll drop it down into the water on the shady side of the boat, and we lower it down until it's no longer visible, and then we bring it back up just to the point where we can see it. And the state water quality standard for Lake George in the summertime is to be just over 4.6 feet. So I drop it down to the point where it just disappears, and then that tells me what our water clarity is. So right now it's really good. We're at a little over 7 feet, so that's really good water clarity for this time of year.
Now we're taking a sample with an integrated sampler. This is a good way to get data that represents the upper layer of the lake, and we fill various bottles to test in our laboratory for the different water quality parameters.
This is our depth sampler. Lake George can be up to 32 feet deep in some spots, so we want to make sure that we get samples that are representative of all the different layers of the lake.
From the projects implemented and Lake George water quality data collected, the lake was removed from the state's impaired waters list in 2022. The lake continues to meet and exceed state water quality standards. With that, practices by the city will continue to be maintained and monitored to ensure they are continuing to do their job and the lake continues to meet Lake George water quality standards. The city will adjust any changes in the lake and continue to implement improvements as needed. With that, you can help us out. Adopt your nearest storm drain and keep it clean to prevent pollutants from washing towards Lake George or to the other waterways like the Mississippi River and Sauk River in St. Cloud. Let's keep working together to keep the City of St. Cloud's water resources safe and clean for everyone to enjoy. With that, we're meeting our standards, we're meeting the goals of our plan, and thank you for listening.